Hey, what's up? This is Mark at Alchemist.camp, where we learn about Elixir and Phoenix by building things. Today, we're going to learn about a library called Ueberauth. It enables OAuth 2 logins, so you can make an app where your users log in with Google, Facebook, Twitter, Slack, quite a few different options, and you can even write your own strategies to support any OAuth 2 provider you want. This time, I'm going to change up the format a bit. Usually we do screencasts where I type out every single thing that needs to be typed to make an entire application or project. But this time, I've already created a project and we're going to do a walkthrough. This is an experiment, so please let me know what you think of it. The reason I'm doing a walkthrough is it's a lot faster. And for those of you that are already familiar with making an OAuth module in a Phoenix app because maybe you saw it in the StatWatch project or the Phoenix 1.4 chat server project that I've taught earlier, you don't want to see me type all of that out again, and you're already familiar enough that a walkthrough is sufficient. If it's too fast or confusing, then you can always hit the spacebar, read the code more carefully, or you can also go check out those earlier projects. So let's get started. The library in question is Ueberauth. We include that in our Elixir app as we would with any other library. We just add it to our make_study_access. But this library takes sub-libraries for each OAuth provider. And we also need the OAuth 2 library as a dependency. Let me just go to the mix file itself. We'll just dive in. And I've set Elixir to version 1.9. Almost all of this was, well, I guess half of these dependencies, the ones above, were auto-generated by Mix Phoenix New, and these are specific to this project. So you need OAuth 2, and you need to set override true, at least if you use these various Ueberauth submodules. That's because they each have different expectations for the version of your OAuth 2 library that conflict. So I just had to force it to version 2.0, and at least for what I've experimented with so far, everything is working. Ueberauth is the core library. Then Ueberauth Identity is for email password logins, which we might not even use Ueberauth for. It's pretty common to just set that up yourself in a Phoenix app. Then there's one for Facebook, one for GitHub, one for Google, one for Slack, one for Twitter. You're probably not going to use all of them. You'll just use whichever ones are set up. This tutorial, I'm just going to use Ueberauth Google. Then we also need Poison, which is the older JSON encoder decoder library. Phoenix 1.1, 1.2, and possibly 1.3 all used it by default. Now it uses JSON by default, which is a bit faster. It's a newer library. The OAuth 2 module uses Poison, so we've included it here as a dependency. In our config.exs, the only change is to import a larger config for ueberauth.exs. And before we go too far, actually, let's show this in action, just so you can see what you'll get if you do all of this. So I've got a Phoenix app running. It's freshly generated. It does have a user table in it. I've generated it with the context generator. So it's in the accounts context called users. We've got this auto-generated list users function here. And you can see we have no users right now. When we click sign in with Google, it will pop up a dialog showing all the Google accounts you're signed into. You choose the one you want to use. Or in my case, I was only signed into Alchemist Camp, so it just logged me in, and it got this image from Google OAuth. And it also got my name, which is just Alchemist Camp, and my email, which I requested. There's a really large auth object that we got out here, or a large struct here. This whole thing comes in. So we've got credentials, we've got a token, we've got a bunch of other stuff here. Locale, picture. You can request, more or less information, and obviously that'll affect the dialogue that pops up, and it also will affect what you need to provide to Google in their dev console in order to set up that OAuth option. But I've just gotten the basics and specifically requested email because most apps are going to want that. So this is what's going to come back from Google's OAuth server. Back to our code walkthrough. We've got our config.exs. We're importing an Ueberauth config, which I created. In our Ueberauth config, we can see two basic kinds of config. One is for the core module, Ueberauth, and then the other is for all of the individual strategies, the Facebook, GitHub, Google, Slack, and Twitter. And all of these individual strategies are just configuring a client ID, a client secret, and a redirect URI. And the way that I've done this, I mean, you could have just hard-coded them in, but what I did is I've just made them system environment variables. So those are all available from the system. I set them in my terminal, and then they're available from our Phoenix app when we're running it. So for example, if I run system.getEnv from our running Phoenix app, you'll see my redirect URI is localhost 4000/auth/google/callback. Then the core module is, I'm going to collapse identity here so it's a little bit clearer. It's basically just a list of providers, and you can pass some information to the providers of what you're asking for. So in this case with Google, I'm requesting email and profile. If you don't specifically request email, you may not get it, and that's a problem for a lot of apps since they use the email for transactional emails, letting people sign up for newsletters, and so forth. Then identity is a little bit longer, but it's still the same structure. We've got a tuple. First thing in the tuple is the module for the strategy, and then we have a list which has configuration options. So instead of default scope, we've got callback method post, UID field, username, nickname field, username, and that's really all there is to it. You're probably less likely to use this than the other strategies, but it is a core one that is built in. In our router, we've got a couple of things we've added here. First is the auth plug. This is the same kind of auth plug that we've gone over in previous projects. It's similar, same kind of structure as what's shown in the Programming Phoenix book from Pragmatic Programmers. It's a pretty common sort of strategy, although I will go through it quickly. Got an auth scope. So if you go to /auth/ this provider is going to be like Google or Facebook. So /auth/Google would be to send the request for the Google OAuth provider, and /auth/Google/callback is the callback that Google will hit and give the information that I showed you in the terminal a little bit ago. And same thing for post. Then if you go to /auth/logout, that's where the delete action is. And that is what we're using here if you click log out. We can log in again. Note that the first time I logged in, it created a user. This time the user was already there, but it found the user existed and logged the user in. So it's a single interface. And that's really all that was changed in the router. This auth module, I've got just an example list of site admins. This is probably the very simplest level structure you could do if you have an app that is created by a very small team, and just enumerate those with admin privileges. And the plug itself, when you call it, it will get a user ID out of the session, and based on that user ID, if the con assigns current user is there, then we just use that as the assigned user. If not, we get the user from the ID out of the accounts context. And this is a function I added myself. Let's just hop over there and look at everything I've changed. So it's just these three functions. Everything else is the same as what was created by the generators. We've got getter create user, which is just what it says it is. So we use repo get by, no exclamation point. So we'll either get a user or we'll get nil. If it's nil, then we'll create a user, and this user struct that was passed into it will have whatever we need for a user. The user module itself is very simple. It's essentially just the default. I've got avatar, email, and name. We're pulling all of those out of the auth struct that comes back. Get user from ID is basically the same thing as our get user bang, except that if the ID is nil, we won't have an error. It'll just return nil. And if the ID is for a user that does not exist, once again, we won't get an error. We'll just return nil. So this is repo.get without the exclamation point. So the user doesn't have to be there. It'll just return nil if the user isn't. Back to our auth module, you can see we try to get a user from the ID. This ID we're passing in might be nil, or it might be invalid. Either way, we'll just end up with nil, so that we put nil into the current user, which is essentially saying nobody is logged in. But if we do have a good user, then we'll get that entire user and we'll put that user into current user. Authenticate admin at these three functions actually. So it just checks the con. If admin user is true, then it continues on as normal. The person trying to access it is an admin, so they can just continue and see it. If it's not an admin and the format is JSON, then we put status unauthorized, we halt, we return JSON with just an error unauthorized. If it's not an admin and it's not Phoenix format JSON, that means it's HTML. So then we put flash, put the error, you don't have access to that page, and we redirect to our page path and halt. So logged in user is the same thing, except instead of checking for an admin user, it's just checking for a current user, and the logic is the same. Put current user is where we're putting all the logic for somebody signing in. First thing we do is we generate a token, and we would use this for channels or any non-HTML request. This hello web.token is a very simple module that uses phoenix.token.sign to sign a token, and then there's a verify function that will use phoenix.token.verify and pass in these options, which are all fairly standard. So it's just a simple wrapper over Phoenix token. After we've got a token, we assign the current user, then we assign the user token, then we assign whether or not they're an admin user. There are obviously much more sophisticated ways we could do this. We could have a roles table in the database, but here we're just making sure we have a user and the user has an email that's in the site admins listed up here at the top. Then finally, we put the user ID in the session, set it to renew, and we put a request header with a bearer token. Now, depending on your app, you may not have all of this. Like you very well may not be using a bearer token. You may not be using channels and have this token. You might just have HTML, or it might be the opposite. You might not have HTML and do everything through tokens. Then to drop the current user, we delete the request header and configure the session to drop, so that logs someone out. The OAuth Controller is a bit more new stuff, although it's fairly similar to controllers you would see for like a session controller, auth controller. We've got an Ueberauth plug, which comes from the library, and we're aliasing Ueberauth strategy helpers, as well as the auth plug we just looked at. Delete here, this is pretty standard for what you'd see in a Phoenix app. The callback is going to contain either an Ueberauth failure or an Ueberauth auth, and this auth is the large auth struct we looked at a little bit ago, right here. We've got some helpers that we'll use to extract just the information we need from that huge auth struct. Those are in the user from auth module we'll look at in a moment. We're also using the get or create user from accounts. And as you recall, this accounts get or create user function we made is taking the email out of a user struct and using that to get the user or to create a new user using the entire user struct. We have to have a user struct in order to call this function. That's what this user from auth finder create will do. Then once someone's logged in, we put the flash, put the current user in the auth module that we just looked at right here. And then if there's a problem, we put a different flash and we redirect. This request function at the bottom is Ueberauth specific. This actually, or it's actually from OAuth 2. It comes from request your deps OAuth 2 lib OAuth 2. We don't really need to know too much about the details of how this works, but we can see them here if we want to. And we're just giving it a URL, callback URL, and this is coming from the helpers, and that is set in our config that we did earlier. So that's how it'll know what callback URL we're going to use. Counts we've already gone over. Only new stuff was these three. User from auth. We've got this finder create function we were using from the auth controller, and we're matching what auth struct is passed back. So if the provider is identity, that means we use user password credentials, and I haven't actually fully built out this part of the app, but this is roughly what it would look like. Got an OK, and then this basic info is a function a little bit further down that reduces the auth struct into a little bit less information that's easier to work with. We get a finder create auth in general. We'll return the OK, the basic info from the auth, and we could make provider specific strategies for this finder create function above it. It turns out that the default I've got here works with Google. Got little helper functions to get the avatar out of that auth. So it's in info URLs, avatar URL. This image is it's going to be the URL. Return that. Got another example here that's not being used in the app. That's how Facebook does it. Then the avatar from auth, if nothing matches, then we'll send a warning. The basic auth function is printing out that full data, as you saw, we don't really need to do, and returning just an ID with the auth UID, the name using the name from auth helper, and the same thing for avatar and email. These various helpers just to pick apart that huge auth struct, and then validate pass if we're using the identity strategy. Got a few requirements here that there is a password, that the passwords match, and obviously you write out whatever requirements you want there. And that is all we need in the user from auth. All that's left after this, save it without that io.puts, made a minor change to the page controller by passing in the current user, and a minor change to, well, actually a big change to the index page. Instead of all of that default page, we've got the Ueberauth plus Phoenix example. Let me unfull screen this so we can see it side by side. You can see basically what we've got here. If a user is logged in, then we show welcome, we show the avatar, and we show a logout button that goes to auth/logout, method delete. If nobody is logged in, then we've got a sign in with Google button and a sign in with username password button. They said this one is not fully implemented. I haven't actually made the page for that, but you get the basic idea of how it's set up. sign in with Google. Now we get our avatar back. And in app.html, I replace the navigation with a current user up here. So see who's logged in. If anyone's logged in, got a current user and current user.name. No one's logged in, that'll disappear. And that is everything I've changed except the database migration. And the only change for the database migration was making a unique index for users with email. And that is the full walkthrough of every change that was made. The only generators used to make this were mix phoenix.new hello, and then mix phoenix gen context accounts, users, avatar, email, name. Now that you've seen this, let me know what you think about the format. If you found it useful, then obviously click like and write a comment. Let me know what you thought about it, also where it could improve, or if you just prefer the screencast style every time. My general thinking is for lower level concepts or super detailed things, it makes sense to type out everything, and I will be doing that for most of the videos. But for larger apps with more moving parts, or even a library like this one with more moving parts, I think it could save a lot of time and be more helpful to people to do walkthroughs instead of screencasts. That's it for today. Till next time, code on.